Today it'll be myself and Nick Swink. Nick is a senior security consultant here at Risk 360. I'm the director of offensive security at Risk 360. And today we're going to be talking quite a bit about Infostealers. As far as just what we'll cover today, we'll start and we'll talk through Infostealers themselves, how they're used, what they are, how threat actors distribute the information that they gather through Infostealers. That'll be me. Then we'll hand it off to Nick, who will go through a deep dive technical analysis of how they, logistically and technically work, the type of infection vectors that they use to gain access. He'll talk through the exploitation phases. He'll talk through some of the defense. And then lastly, we will follow up and finish up by talking through two incidents that started through Infostealers. First one being Change Healthcare, which was a huge breach. And then the other one being, you hear it often referred to as Snowflake incident. However, it was not a Snowflake incident, but we'll get to that when we get to that point. So Infostealers account for a growing number of initial attack vectors. They're extremely popular, and they're extremely effective. They're really effective because there's a couple things that they're doing, right? So they're info stealers. So what they're looking for is simply information that's on the machine. And that could be things like session cookies. That could be things like maybe API keys that are in, a folder somewhere. That could be things like passwords. Like sometimes maybe they have a keylogger and they can grab a password that you're putting in. But they're going through primarily the biggest attack vector, or the biggest collection method rather, is browser cookies and session tokens and that kind of thing. So traditionally, if we think through what attackers have done for a very long time, there was a really big focus on the endpoint itself. So we saw lots of different things occur on the endpoint itself, primarily around particular malware that would attempt to give a threat actor access to the machine, right? And it went on like this for a very long time. We focused on doing syscalls in Windows and performing different actions so that we could gain access to the endpoint and then move laterally in traditional networks, and just basically gain access to that endpoint. The fact of the matter is that EDR nowadays is really good. There's lots of ways to bypass them. In fact, just maybe a month or two ago, there was a pretty big bypass for Sentinel-1. There's still ways to get around them, but the fact of the matter is that the barrier to entry, or rather the lift required to compromise and keep persistence on that endpoint, it's become much more difficult. Even compared to maybe 4 years ago, 3 years ago, the EDR and the endpoint detection, CrowdStrike, Sentinel-1, et cetera, has gotten really good. And so what are threat actors going to do? They're going to figure out easier ways to do things, right? You can't blame them for that. And so what we've seen is that they've really made the shift towards info stealers. And there's from a detection perspective. Now they still might get detected, right? Or when they initially land on that machine, but they're not necessarily doing too many things that could possibly get them picked up. So again, with traditional EDR, if you're able to gain access to a machine, usually you need to escalate, elevate privileges. You got to do things on that machine that EDR might see, and you might get caught, right? Because you're making calls to create processes, for example, or do all these other different things to evade detection or to move around on that endpoint. With info stealers, they basically just need to land on that machine, and then they can quietly just read files or read keys or whatever it is, and then ship them out, right? So what they usually do is when they are trying to compromise another machine or gain access to another machine, they usually start with an initial lure. So one of the big ones that you'll see is through malvertising, so malicious advertising. Nick is going to go into detail on that in just a little bit. I'll talk a little bit more about it as well, but they basically use malvertising as one of their big ways to deploy their info stealers, their actual binaries that are doing the information collection. And once they get on there, again, they're quiet. They're just sitting there. They're gathering information. They're gathering credentials, and they're shipping it off somewhere. In fact, we will, in just a few minutes here, we will look at what some of these logs look like. So when they gather this information and they ship it off to their C2, they will, um, basically log them all and then sell that access. And we'll take a look at those in a little bit. It starts with, gaining access. They deploy. They're relatively quiet once they're actually on the machine, and then they quietly just ship off this information to various C2s or other collection methods that threat actors have created. Like I said, malvertising is a really big one. If you're not familiar with malvertising, it's been around for a while now. There's some estimates that say that up to 30% of Google's ad revenue comes from either malicious or fraudulent accounts. So I haven't updated or done additional research on that in a little bit, but the point is that it happens a lot. And really what they're doing is one way or another, they're gaining access to an advertising account on either Google Ads or Bing, whatever it is. They either create them using fake identities, so they'll create a fresh a Google Ads account, or they gain access to them in some way, which Google's pretty good about protecting Google accounts in general. So that happens. Don't get me wrong, but one way or another, they get access to or create an ad account. They run those ads. Typically, what they'll do is we talked about KeyPass. If you watch our weekly executive brief, probably about a month ago, we talked about KeyPass, to where threat actors had registered a similar domain name to KeyPass, and they created a backdoor version of KeyPass. So this backdoor version worked just the way that it should. It stored your passwords. I mean, it did everything that it should have done. However, this backdoor version then shipped off master passwords and, some cases, entire password databases to threat actors. So they will create some sort of way for them to compromise the endpoint. They'll use lookalike domains. And what happens is, if you, for example, were Googling for KeyPass, they will show ads for KeepPass or something similar. That's just an example. But they will show ads for a lookalike domain that includes either landing pages or sign-up forms, browser extensions. Malicious browser extensions are a pretty big one. But in the example of KeyPass, they just had just a straight backdoored version of it. And so when users downloaded it, it worked as it intended. They didn't even realize that they got it from the lookalike domain, and threat actors were able to basically do what they wanted. Malvertising is a big, uh, it's a big initial access vector, not only for Infostealer, but you name it. Threat actors have been using this method for quite a long time. It's pretty effective, and in many ways, it's hard for the um, advertising platforms to really detect it. These advertising platforms are pretty much automated. They're meant to be easy for advertisers to just spin up an ad. Like that's one of the key selling points. I mean, that is the key selling point. So they can easily spin things up and create new ads and do that kind of thing. So it's relatively difficult, I think, for these ad platforms to detect and monitor and really do anything about. So it's malvertising in general is a very big attack initial access vector for threat actors. Again, not only for info stealers, but for all kinds of malicious activities. We talked about how, once they're on the machine and they are gathering the sensitive information, they ship it out. One of the big ways that they do this is with Telegram and Discord. So Telegram is definitely, last year, the founder of Telegram, I can never remember his name. The founder of Telegram was arrested in France, and after that, Telegram started to really help authorities out. They started to really just be much more helpful than they were in the past. Before that arrest in France, Telegram would not do anything. So if a government reached out to them, they would essentially just ignore it. There was lots of malicious activities happening on Telegram, and various governments around the world would attempt takedowns or attempt to get more information on specific users. And Telegram just would ignore them basically. And so this is why Telegram flourished for so long with threat actors, because they basically could go on there and do whatever they wanted without any repercussions. After that arrest, Telegram has changed. And so, you start to see things move to different locations. Matrix servers is one. However, when it comes to Infostealers, there is a lot of activity on Discord. So you'll see a lot of Discord servers to where, various threat actors are either selling or using Discord as an exfiltration mechanism. This is not this is a somewhat common technique to use known services for exfiltration or command and control. We've seen it in various different ways. Discord's a pretty big one that it happens. But what you're really starting to see here is, again, Telegram was a big one and it's still active. Don't get me wrong. There's still this work happening, but what we've started to see is it move more towards either Discord or other C2 channels or servers like Matrix servers. Once they gather all this information, of course, the whole reason they're doing this, one of the big reason they're doing this, anyone can go and buy these. So there's various info stealers, which again, Nick is going to get into the variants and the different ways that they do things. There's various info stealers that you can go and basically buy what's known as stealer logs. And if we look here, you can see this is a dark web forum where all of these that you see here, these are all individual stealer logs, and you can see, there's lots of different types of info stealers and versions of it. But this is I just went on this morning and grabbed a quick screenshot. This is what it looks like. You can actually go here, and some of them, like that first one, for example, you can see it says free. Some of them, there's free samples, and you can just go ahead and check it out, right? It's been easy for a long time to buy these logs. And what you'll see in a lot of examples here is some of them are like, 24 million lines. If you look, down a couple things there, you'll see 24 million lines, 7.4 million, right? So that means that there's 7.4 million entries of how they structure these logs as URL, login, typically an email, and then password. And so each line is the URL that you can log into, the login and the password for it. And so if there's 7.4 million lines, that means there's 7.4 million individual entries. And so once all this information is collected, they are typically put up for sale. Of course, they might, siphon off some bigger ones that maybe they want to take for themselves. But for all intents and purposes, these info stealers are collecting millions upon millions of credentials and sensitive information every day. They put it into a log, what's known as a stealer log, and then, of course, they sell them. So at a very high level, that's what stealer logs are all about. Get on the machine, quietly collect sensitive information, send it off somewhere, collect it in that way, and then sell it. This is an example from a dark web forum, but what I wanted to do, and we're gonna see if this actually works here. So we mentioned Telegram here on the screen, hopefully, which I think you can see. Here you can see we're in Telegram. We are in an actual Telegram channel of one of these threat actors who is selling stealer logs. And so you can see the prices here. They typically have, it's not a subscription-based model. But some of them are subscription-based models, but you can buy access for a certain amount of time. As you can see here on the left, it's saying, private cloud prices, we're $40 for a week, $100 for a month. And this basically gets you access to their updated stealer logs. It's not uncommon for them to put out free. So I don't know if you realize in the previous screenshot, but some of those titles in those forum posts actually say free in them. So some of them are free, and these threat actors are like businesses, right? Personally, I've been saying this for a long time when I talk about ransomware crews. They're businesses, right? They're not dumb, right? They know what they're doing. And just like any other business, they need to market themselves. So they will often release, free batches of Stealer logs so that you can get an idea of what they're actually getting and, the quality of the data, all that kind of stuff. So what you'll see here is this is one from this is one of those free, sample Stealer logs that you can get. This is what an actual Stealer log looks like. So um, depending on how big they are, sometimes they come in compressed zip files or RAR files, actually, WinRAR. Sometimes they're just straight text. Sometimes you can actually buy API access to just pull these lists down. There's lots of different ways you can get it. The most common way, though, is in some sort of text file. So this is that free sample that I pulled down from that Telegram channel. And if we, I don't know how many are here, 300K, maybe 300,000, something like that. Yeah, it's probably not gonna scroll all the way down, but it's probably about 300,000, entries. And as we can see here, here's the URLs. Here's the URLs. There's a login and there's a password. So this is public information. Normally I wouldn't want to share this, but this is pretty much everywhere at this point because it's a free one. But you can see this is what they actually look like. They go on these dark web forums, or these Telegram channels, or these Matrix servers, or these Discord servers. They give out free samples. You can pay to get, updated information, and you can pay to get updated information, and it's extremely, um, I mean, it's extremely effective, and that's why we've seen a double digit percentage increase in the deployment and usage of malware of Infostealers, again because they're quiet. It's not like it used to be where threat actors were focused on the endpoint. They're focused on the credentials now. In fact, that I think it was the Cloud Security Alliance has recently put out some data, basically saying that about 60% of security incidents start with some sort of breach credentials or misconfiguration. That's a pretty big piece, because threat actors nowadays, why do they need to worry about the endpoint? I mean, really, everything is software as a service, and like we'll talk about with Snowflake, everything is software as a service. So if they can gain access to that software, in the case of Snowflake, for example, they pulled hundreds of millions of records from over 160 businesses, just because they had, username password combinations. And actually, in these cases, MFA was not enforced. We'll talk through that in a little bit. But very easy, very lucrative, and it really is much less effort than focusing on the endpoint. So again, at a high level, those are info stealers. That's what they are. That's what Stealer logs look like. We'll hand it off to Nick here, who Nick will do a little bit more of a technical deep dive on how they work, how they actually ship that type of information off. And yeah, Nick, it's all you.
Cool stuff, Corey. I think it was actually 3 million, if I saw the number correctly on that line.
Did you? I'm tired, so maybe I think you might be right. Yeah, you were right. It is 3 million. I miss a
Yeah,
zero.
that's
Good,
a big scroll bar.
good thing I'm not an accountant.
Hey, Cory, Andy here.
Yeah.
Quick question. This is very interesting information, but my question personally is, who are the buyers and what do they intend to do with it?
Yeah. So the buyers are ransomware groups. They are individual threat actors. The way that a lot of this ecosystem works is there are uh, so I'm going to try not to go down a rabbit hole because I like to talk about this stuff, but it basically boils down to a lot of this ecosystem starts with what's known as initial access brokers. So these initial access brokers traditionally are like the real deal, just just hacking away, doing reverse engineering, binary exploitation, that kind of thing. They're finding O days in different pieces of software. That's traditionally the initial access brokers are the ones that have really started to, or not really, that have really always done like the real deal technical work with like O days and that kind of stuff. So then they would gain access to a network or whatever it is, and then they would simply just sell that access. What normally happens is a ransomware group or a data extortion group or whatever will just buy that access and then do whatever they want to do. With ransomware crews, for example, I don't think most people realize that those ransomware crews are not, most of the time, they're not doing the initial access, right? Don't get me wrong, there's cases where, they, like, I think it was Klopp built like, some O-Day for, maybe it was Fortinet, don't quote me on that, but they built an O-Day and went and exploited it. But most of these ransomware crews are just buying access, and they deploy their ransom and then they collect. So as the ecosystem goes, it basically initial access broker, threat actor to do some sort of other malicious activity, and then it goes from there. And so what you're seeing now is that a lot of these threat actors, instead of using an initial access broker, they will simply just buy these stealer logs and shoot their shot and see if they can get access to these things. Because depending on what it is, they might be able to just, if it's a ransomware crew, it might be something that allows them to pivot into a network, for example. For data extortion crew, like with Snowflake, for example, if they can get into Snowflake, which is just a huge database for all intents and purposes, if they can get into Snowflake and exfiltrate all that data, like they did with Snowflake, AT&T's data, Santander Bank's data, Ticketmaster, a whole bunch of them, they can go from there. So it's traditional threat actors, again, whether they're ransomware crews, whether they're data extortion crews, regardless of what they are, they're using and buying these stealer logs as an alternative to using traditional initial access brokers.
Thanks so much, Cory. Wow, that's so interesting. And that really paints a clear picture of really how this economy works. Because you would think that it's the same people or person doing from beginning to end, but you're mentioning brokers and buyers. And that's very clear about how this economy, it really is an economy, a business economy. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Like Cory said, I'm going to go into some of the technical information about this ecosystem of builders and stealers and cryptors and what all these things are. So I'm going to talk about the different components involved, then some infection vectors that are popular, some evasion techniques, um, some of the post-exploitation activities that go on after the fact, and then finally some defense and detection. So it really starts off at the top here with the non-technical criminal or the technical criminal. It really just depends on who the buyer is. And they'll typically buy access to a user panel, which will have a builder. And these are typically licensed. So they get license keys just like you get license keys for like Adobe Photoshop. And then you can manage your infections and stuff like that in the user panel. And then the builder application essentially allows you to build the stealer malware. It's really just plug and play. And then typically they're going to take these, throw them into a cryptor program, and that's going to apply some sort of obfuscation evasion techniques that get the stealer malware to actually execute on different endpoints. And then or a lot of times it'll pack it into like a long infection chain, basically do the hard work for them. And then they can distribute that to their victims. And once those execute, they are sent back, the information sent back to a C2 server and gets populated in like a nice dashboard for them. So they can see all the information. There's webhooks involved to Telegram sometimes where it just dumps the information. People pay for access to those dumps or pay access to be a member of certain Telegram channels. And that's kind of how this ecosystem of this malware as a service subscription model really works. Why do they do this model? So there's the developers for the most part, there's just developers and there's the buyers. So developers do this because it gives them that stable recurring revenue, just like any business model nowadays that does a subscription model like Netflix or whatever. It gives them recurring revenue as opposed to that one-time purchase. Like I'm sure you remember Photoshop. You used to just be able to buy, and then you owned it. It was on your computer. Now you don't. Now you have to pay a subscription to like Adobe Cloud or whatever it is, and then at any point they can revoke the license for that program. And this is trying to work the same way. Obviously, just like with real software, they're going to be subject to like cracking the software, which has happened with Stealers, just like it's happened with Photoshop, um, and then distributed even further. And then it also allows them to upsell on different features like support. They have full-time support, just like I keep using Adobe, but just like anything else, tech support, like you're having issues with our malware Stealer builder, like we can help you with that and we'll help you troubleshoot. So it's a good model for the developers and it's a good model for the buyers because it gives them this plug and play, essentially Stealer as a service malware where they get active support, they get access to any updates that come out. So like if something gets burned or there's like a new feature, you can request features. Hey, can you support stealing cookies from this browser? They submit a ticket, and then they can implement that feature and get access to that with this subscription model. So we can dive into the builders and slash panels. So some of the time these are the same entity. Um, Depending on whether they are a desktop application or web-based. What they really allow for is you to get in there, manage your infections, and build payloads. So build the Stealer program. There's a number of different configuration settings that you get access to, so you can stamp in different C2 addresses, webhooks, so like stuff like Telegram or Discord, like Cory was saying. Um, and then different evasion features, so like anti-sandboxing, um, anti-VM, so detecting whether it's in a sandbox or a VM, um, custom keywords for files to search for. Say you were like targeting a certain organization, you knew they name their files a certain thing that you're looking for, and you can like stamp into the builder, look for these files with this name in it. And then basically they just hit build for all intents and purposes, and they can generate a executable or whatever the format is, and it spits out just a nice clean file for them to move further along the process with and distribute or pack with like a cryptor. So I'm going to talk about the cryptors in a moment here. And then the last thing just to mention is that a lot of them do have some built-in obfuscation, but that's not the sole purpose of the Stealer. The sole purpose is to have as many features as possible in terms of things it can steal. And they're all kind of in competition with each other. Like, oh, Luma Stealer can now steal Chrome, app-bound encryption cookies. So like this one's like a mark ahead. Now the other Stealers will try to implement the same thing, and they're kind of in an arms race in that sense. Here's an example here of the Redline builder. This is a .NET GUI, I believe, and it basically allows you to manage your infections, um, configure your builders, and this was actually a cracked software version that got cracked. So basically, they found a way around the licensing key and then distributed it. You could see Telegram support, different categories here, just like a nice desktop application that you might use. And this would probably be sent over via like a zip file or something in a Telegram channel. And then they have basically access to this builder and they can build their payloads. Another example here is SteelC v2. So this one's actually cloud or web-based. You could probably notice some of the icons look very familiar. So you can see different checkboxes that enable different features in these samples. And you can name your builds and stuff like that. So it's really like any other commercial software that you're going to buy, and they try to make it look nice, and you get access to these web panels that are usually hosted on Tor, and then you can build out the programs and manage infections, basically, depending on whether the stealer stays active on the machine. They can upsell different features like adds persistence and stays running on the machine, or like keyloggers, stuff like that. So the actual payload. So this is the stealer program. What does it target? There's really two types of data. There's corporate data and then there's personal data. The corporate data is going to be, like Cory said, anything that's going to give them initial access into a corporation. This is typically high value data. So like stuff like VPN credentials, single sign-on tokens, um, anything that's going to give a foothold into the organization, because that may get turned into like a full ransomware operation. They'd have to, move laterally and escalate and do all that kind of stuff. But that's typically sold to a certain type of a threat actor. There's the personal data that's typically sold for more identity theft. And then there's also the big thing with cryptocurrency wallets. So crypto wallets are one of the main targets for a lot of stealers, because it's so easy to get the wallet information and basically drain the wallets. There's even features called clippers on some Infostealers where they monitor the clipboard of the Windows host, and so they detect if you ever copy a Bitcoin wallet to the clipboard, it detects that, and then it replaces it with a malicious wallet. And then so when you're copying paste a wallet to do a transaction, it swaps that wallet, and then you're pasting their wallet, and then you're transferring money to that. So some pretty malicious but kind of cool features. Programming languages. Infostealers are written in a lot of different languages. Mainly, this is important because of what kind of implications it has for its evasion capabilities and speed and stuff like that. A lot of it's based on prior leaks of source code. So when you see a big leak in the source code of some stealer, you're going to see a bunch of variants pop up, like new Infostealers branded, like, new Infostealer, blah, blah, blah. They'll brand it as something completely new, but it's really just like almost 90% stolen source code. I think Zeus, when that got leaked a long time ago, really started, which was like the first banking Trojan, uh, really kicked off this kind of ecosystem of like iterating on prior source code that just kind of does the same thing, but then like very rarely is there a novel, completely newly written stealer that's implemented. And at the core of it, a lot of them are doing the same techniques, but most of them are written in these four here. So C++, it's going to compile down to like native binaries, which is good for speed and avoids .NET stuff. So it can't be easily turned into like IL code and then like basically view the source. .NET code is really good for fast development. So with these stealers, they can easily iterate and create new desktop GUIs and payloads, because they're not having to deal with like memory management stuff. And then Golang and Rust, these kind of more niche, but Rust has some interesting capabilities with its basically obfuscation of like the intermediary code language, to where it's much harder to reverse engineer. Although it does seem to produce very large binaries because of some of the Rust packages that get statically linked. But I think there's ways to remove those out. But I do suspect there's going to be a lot more new info stealers coming about with AI and vibe coding and stuff, because they can quickly iterate and develop code. Cryptors. Cryptors are basically, if you've ever heard of a shellcode loader or something like that, or PE loader, it basically takes in a PE file, DLL, whatever, usually a portable executable, so like exe, DLL, service exe, but something like that. And then it wraps that original program and gets it to execute in a way that implements different evasion features. So you could have the same stealer program that gets detected on a endpoint, and then you could run it through a cryptor and it could get not detected, which means because it's implementing these different evasion features. So super useful for stealer developers to make sure their users are using cryptors, because it protects that original sample from being signatured to hell and basically burned. So a lot of times they'll refer people to affiliates who use a cryptor as a service model. So it's basically the same thing, whether it's like a command line tool or GUI. Most of them I think are like command line tools, and they basically just wrap that original program and get it to execute in a way that is evasive. So when you see a new successful Stealer campaign, it's probably all coming down to the cryptor and whatever the cryptor's doing. So some examples here. Coffee Loader, there's big buzz about that recently because it used some, it side loaded like Asus Armory packages, I think, and like used some decryption functions that were native to Asus Armory, which is like a legitimate software for Asus components. I think my headset's Asus actually. When you see a new successful Stealer campaign, it's really probably coming down to whatever they're packing it with and whatever the infection chain is turned into. So I have some examples here, I think, of some of the advertisement for these cryptors. So they put a bunch of flashy stuff and they say all of the features of the cryptors. So these are all just like different evasion features. Bypass UAC, ETW bypass, AMZ bypass, stuff like this. It's really, if you work in offensive security, you see this stuff talked about a lot. And who knows if these cryptors are actually even doing any of this stuff. Again, this is like we're dealing with criminals, so you don't know if it's legitimate or not. But obviously, they're going to make it look like it's the best thing ever. A lot of times, they'll also have POC videos in these Telegram channels, so they'll show either like, "Hey, this person bought it and watch it bypass this antivirus or this EDR," and then that'll be a selling point for someone that's interested in that kind of thing and doesn't want to go through the development hurdles of creating their own. All right. Evasion techniques. So again, we should separate the cryptor or loaders from the stealers themselves. So they're really doing the things that malware's been doing for a long time, which is like anti-sandboxing techniques, obfuscation, sleep timers, and some of the newer stuff's like multi-stage infection chains. So drawing out the infection chain to like 3, 4, 5, 6 stages. Maybe you drop like an LNK file, which triggers PowerShell, which pulls down a DLL with a web request and then drops it into a thing to be sideloaded. Like stuff like this, it's been having to get more and more elaborate because of endpoint detection. Like Cory was talking about, endpoint detection has gotten so good in the last probably like 7 years that they really need to iterate and do things that are basically unexpected or have never been, the behavior's never been signatured before. One of the most important things is the anti-sandboxing, because if you, as a person who, if someone has a sandbox, they really want that true payload to run, because then they can see all the things it's doing with file interactions and stuff like that, and that behavior can be signatured and make IOCs for like YAR rules and stuff like that. So um, making sure that the payload never runs in a sandbox is one of the most important things to these Stealer devs, because it protects that software from the true behavior being seen. This is when you're talking about evasion, this is an important point to bring up. So Chromium's app-bound encryption was introduced about a year ago, and it basically completely shook up the Stealer market because of the way it changed how Chrome and all Chromium-based browsers. So if you don't know, it's like Chrome, Microsoft Edge, Opera, one other popular one. Firefox is not a Chromium-based browser, notably. But basically, it changed the way Chrome encrypts or does encryption with its cookies and logon passwords. So Chrome, the process itself, no longer does the encryption and decryption, or I should say it no longer does the decryption because it passes it off to a Windows service. So prior to this, stealers could just steal two files off of the file system. It was like the local state file and some other file that had the AES key in it. And then they could just decrypt the cookies and have the value for all of the user's cookies and stuff like that. And log on passwords. So like if you've ever like went in Chrome or any other Chromium browser and logged into something and it says, do you want to save this password in the upper right? And you clicked yes, that would be stolen, and basically they would have all of those passwords. This changed that a bit. So now the service they implemented checks whether the decrypting process is Chrome itself, and it also uses Windows DP API for encryption. So you can't encrypt it offline off of that machine because it uses Windows's native native encryption, which relies on the user's like NTLM identity. So now it basically forced these Stealer developers to implement more overt techniques, stuff like process injection, like into the Chrome process, so that the Chrome process is the one decrypting it. And it overnight raised the bar for these Stealer developers. So they have to do more. And Chrome, I think, knew that people were going to develop bypasses quickly to this, but it did raise the bar to force Stealer developers to do things that have been signatured for decades, like process injection and stuff like that. So it really enhanced the security for protecting cookies and logon passwords, which previously were very simple to just steal from someone's computer. All right, we made it to command and control. So this is after the files have been collected and dumped. Some of them do per file like uploads, or some zip the whole thing and send it off. The biggest thing we see with the command and control is a plethora of C2 connection strings, so that if and when domains are taken down and IPs are taken down, there's always a fallback. And adding 6+ fallback C2 connections plus Discord webhooks and Telegram webhooks that it'll dump these files to as well. This is pretty common. And usually they implement some sort of victim tracking so they can know if a victim's been infected before, basically. So maybe they send like a UUID or something in the HTTP request, so that they can track the victim and make sure they know if they've been infected before, and they can keep like an identity to that victim. And typically these are sending files with post requests HTTP. I mean, older versions and stuff may have used like FTP or something like that, but pretty much they're all using web protocols. They're all using web HTTP with post requests, and implementing some sort of encoding or encryption to the zip files to make sure they're not detected going outbound. Nothing too crazy there. Basically followed the same pattern that a lot of malware does. So this is an example of Luma Stealer's C2 infrastructure, which I believe they they actually host the C2 infrastructure with the service, so you don't even need to do that. They have a bunch of these C2 addresses that are basically sending their traffic to a Cloudflare proxy that sends it to the original C2. And this way they hide the original C2 address or addresses from the victim machine. So the victim machine, if you reverse engineer the malware, you're never going to find the original C2 address. So this is broken into two parts, the delivery and the execution. So as Cory talked about, the delivery methods are mainly like the ones we all know about: malvertising, trojanized apps, and phishing, and a lot of these overlap in some way. But malvertising is probably the worst culprit, in my opinion, because of it. Basically, like Google Ads, you'll get the first search result will be malware, which is just like totally unacceptable in my opinion. But it's no wonder that people fall for this, because they're trained in their mind that the first three search results are probably the thing they're looking for. So they go to it. It's a lookalike domain, and then they basically are downloading a malicious file. And then the actual execution. So the most popular we've seen in probably the past like 3 years, 4 years, is this click fix technique, which I have a couple images for. And then your classic file-based execution. So anything that's like double clickable, LNK files, JScript, exe, CPL, like all those things have been used and are used for the delivery. So you're going to see a lot of like delivery that's done through fake landing pages. Like this is ChatGPT for download. I don't even think ChatGPT has a desktop application, but there's like, people won't know, and you download some exe and you run it. Crack software is a big distribution point. So Sony Vegas, like that's a video editing thing, but maybe they'll advertise fake software or like mods for games and stuff like that, and you download it and try to run it, and it's just ultimately an info stealer. And then here's an example of the Google advertising malvertising that's just kind of plain wrong. I mean, you search Audacity, and it's a free program. You go to download it, and the first search result is an ad, which barely even tells you it's an ad with the little text there. And then you go to it, and it's just a malicious page that has malware. We saw something recently that advertised like a Google extension, and it was like I think it was like the first or second search result, and it was there for months, even though I reported it. Users should really be trained on what malvertising is, and don't ever trust Google ads or probably any search engine ads. ClickFix is kind of a silly technique that shouldn't be a thing, but it is. Basically, like if you visit any web page, maybe you don't know this, but the JavaScript of the web page can put things on your clipboard. So your copy and paste, it can put things on your clipboard. So next time you paste something, it was overwritten by the web page. So what they do is they insert a PowerShell command or some shell command into your clipboard, and then they have a fake CAPTCHA here that tells you to run Windows key R, which opens the run dialog on Windows, and then basically Control V to paste the data, which is the PowerShell command, and then run it by pressing enter. So if you do that, you're going to see this run dialog pop up, which if you don't know, then you might just think it's something to do with the browser. And then you'll see this PowerShell command, and then at the end here they have like a comment that's kind of like, it's kind of silly, but it's basically a PowerShell comment to look like what they expect in the caption. Here's an example on Mac. So they have a fake Cloudflare pop up, and then they have you running basically terminal. This one's a little bit more obvious in my opinion, but you have to run command space, it opens the Spotlight thing, and then you open terminal, and then you're pasting again some command that they've basically injected into your clipboard. It's kind of a silly technique, but it's been very effective, and they wouldn't use it if it hasn't been very effective to get people to execute commands. For post-exploitation, Cory touched on this. Mainly, it depends on who they are and what they're selling to. So maybe they are an initial access broker, in which case they can sell access to like a more vetted group that's maybe a ransomware group or something like that. Or they're just selling log dumps in mass, as many as they can. And once these are bought and the initial access is verified by whatever group buys it, they're probably going to establish some sort of persistence and then see what access they have in the network. It depends on what it is. If it's VPN creds or if it's like an email cred, they might launch a internal phishing campaign with the business email. So business email compromise. They might see if they have access to Entra ID, create different things within Entra ID if they can. And then ultimately, it depends on what group is performing the activities, but they're going to try to cause an impact to the business so that they can make some sort of profit out of it, whether it's resell access. So maybe initial access broker would buy it, elevate their access in the network, and then sell that access to some other group. They might sell the email or the initial access just directly to some other ransomware group, or again, they might just sell in mass like these dumps in Telegram and charge people like, you know, however much money for this high value data that's been vetted. But either way, they're going to try and use the information in it to breach the exterior part of the organization or the person, and cause an impact to the business to make a profit. So I'm going to touch on some of the defense and detection here. So the biggest thing here is that I think the first thing that should be done is user training on malvertising. This will help a lot with stopping users from downloading stuff that's on Google Ads, because like we know, it can't be trusted. And then after they're trained to that, if they still are downloading stuff and executing it, again, you got to focus on the endpoint. So Windows Defender is not going to be enough. Like, and I'm talking about the antivirus here. You're going to want some sort of enterprise endpoint detection and response, not just for the initial stealer program, but if they do make initial access to some exterior service, you're going to want those endpoints protected with an EDR. Application whitelisting can be a great thing to stifle applications that aren't trusted within the organization. So it basically will prevent any executable program from being run that's not trusted via either name or hash or whatever. That can be a great thing to hinder people just downloading and running stuff. Obviously, restricting people from local admin is another really important one. And then network wise, so if they do compromise credentials, or basically credentials or different material that could give them exterior access, conditional access policies are a great thing to prevent people that shouldn't be logging in from areas in the world they shouldn't be logging into, making sure their host is meets like an Intune policy or something like that. So basically, it just really hinders their ability to use that information they got from the stealer log. IP whitelistings kind of plays into conditional access. 2FA can help sometimes. I say sometimes because when you're dumping cookies, these are usually cookies that are granted after 2FA has already been processed. So these are like access tokens. They're not credentials that you put in a password, then you do 2FA. It's after you get 2FA. So 2FA can be helpful for preventing access to things just with if they gained access to plain text credentials. So and domain whitelisting, if possible. A lot of organizations have trouble with this because of how restrictive it can be. Basically preventing things based on their domain categorization, and this would prevent just newly spun up domains from being connected to and sending out data, which again isn't bulletproof because a lot of these threat actors can use legitimate programs or legitimate services like Discord and Telegram. Telegram should probably be, honestly, should probably be blocked, but Discord and stuff like that, Dropbox, these are legit services that it's going to be hard to block without causing some sort of disruption in the org.
So just to recap, basically started talking through malware as a service. So if we're not familiar with ransomware as a service, you can basically, and Nick talked about it, sign up for subscription to create these Stealer binaries and these Stealer applications. And then the same thing with the cryptors. So if if you're using that binary, that Infostealer binary, you can then buy an additional piece of software, basically, to crypt that that Infostealer to hopefully increase your chances of actually getting deployed and start to collect information. Malvertising, we talked a lot about that. I think that's probably a serious problem that a lot of people don't necessarily realize. And then browser extensions as well. I know someone mentioned in the chat, you'd be surprised how many malicious browser extensions are out there. Actually, within the past probably 2 months, I've either been a part of or had discussions with clients that had incidents that started from malicious browser extensions. So that's been something. There's been a lot of research actually in that where different individuals have gone through the Chrome store and looked at all these browser extensions and just started to poke at a handful of them and very easily, identified a ton of malicious extensions there. What we're going to do now is we're going to talk through two incidents that originated from Infostealers, Change Healthcare and Snowflake. I'm sure you had to have read about Change Healthcare last year. It really started with credentials that were found in an Infostealer log. In this case, Change Healthcare was using a Citrix remote access portal. And so these credentials that were in Stealer logs, the threat actors had them. They identified the Citrix access portal and logged in. So one common theme, which I think I'm probably tired of talking about, is MFA. There was no MFA, which I'm not going to say that MFA is the be all end all, but it's definitely because there's techniques like MFA fatigue and that kind of thing, but there was no MFA in the case of Change Healthcare. They had these credentials, they identified the Citrix host, and they logged in. When they logged in, they exfiltrated a whole lot of data. We don't know exactly how much, but in testimony, United Health Group, which owns Change Healthcare, United Health Group CEO referred to it as a substantial amount of data. We've later came to find out it was roughly 190 million Americans, PHI and PII, and in some cases medical records. But the threat actors logged in. They start exfiltrate data, which is a common playbook for ransomware actors. Once they get in there, they take a little bit of time. They identify where the data is, and then they exfiltrate that data. So, by the time you actually see a ransom note or you see files that are encrypted by the ransomware crew, they've already done the majority of stuff they want to do, which is primarily exfiltrate data. That's what they did in this case. Once they got in there, they exfiltrated the data, and then they deployed ransomware. In this case, it was ALV ransomware. So the ransomware ecosystem is interesting. The ransomware variant was ALV-V's ransomware. However, it was deployed by another group called Ransom Hub. So we mentioned malware as a service. At this point, we're talking about ransomware as a service. So ALV offers everything that you need to deploy ransomware and collect payment. And that's what Ransom Hub was doing. They used ALV-V's ransomware as a service to encrypt all of Change Healthcare. And 9 days after initial access, they actually deployed that ransomware and ended up again about 192 million Americans PHI and PII were disclosed. Total impact between Change Healthcare primarily does medical claims management and payments. So basically, all the medical payments, right? They handle about 50% of the US's medical claims. So total cost between redeploying everything, the losses due to Change Healthcare being down, recovery costs, all that kind of stuff, ended up being around $2.3 billion. And it all started with an Infostealer, right? It all started with an Infostealer. If we look at the timeline of this particular attack, on February 12th, we know that threat actors authenticated to that Citrix portal that we mentioned. Again, MFA was not enforced. Between February 17th and 20th of 2024, they exfiltrated again a substantial amount of data. They then deployed ransomware on February 21st. And at that time, once the ransomware was deployed, United Health Group essentially shut down Change Healthcare. That all intents and purposes. The outages, as far as Change Healthcare's medical payments and systems built to do that, that downtime was primarily because Change Healthcare basically just unplugged the wire for all intents and purposes, because they were in such a bad spot. They were in a really bad spot, and so United Health Group on the 21st of February disconnected Change Healthcare's data centers and put full IR into place. In the following timelines, you'll see ransomware group ALV gets a payment. So in this case, ALV received $22 million from Change Healthcare. I mentioned ransomware as a service. So a lot of times what will happen is Ransom Hub was using ALV ransomware as a service. So when the payments are made, it's actually made to ALV, and then ALV gives Ransom Hub their cut. This was the drama in the threat actor, the ransomware world in 2024, to where ALV did not pay Ransom Hub. Ransom Hub, of course, was pretty upset about that. And since they had all the data from Change Healthcare, even though they paid the $22 million, they then got double extorted because Ransom Hub didn't get their cut from ALV. And Ransom Hub started to publish the exfiltrated data. Ransom Hub and ALV actually nowadays they're pretty much out of service here. They're not around too much now. Side note: some of the other threat actors that have really started to take off are Quillen, if you want to call it that, which is another ransomware crew which has been on an absolute tear. So these two groups left, and what do you know? There's someone there to take over. In April and May of 2024, United Health Group CEO, confirmed the incident. And then, as is with most of these incidents, the estimates were revised. Originally it was about 100 million people estimated. Of course, as they got in there, they did forensic analysis, and they really started to look at what the data, what data was exfiltrated. They came to find out it was closer to 192 million people. It all started with an Infostealer. So there's a threat intelligence organization called Hudson Rock, which monitors some of these things, and this is their detection of this set of credentials being identified in a Stealer log. And so you can see here, it's basically showing you remoteapps.changehealthcare.com. So if we remember the format that we typically see in these Stealer logs, it's URL, login, password. And so like we do this too with our attack surface management is where, you can monitor for specific URLs. And so in this case, they went through and they looked through some Stealer logs. They identified this Change Healthcare URL, which was for their Citrix portal. And then of course the login and password. And so, this is where it all started. 192 million Americans information exposed, all because of an info stealer. I've said it a couple times already, but they're becoming more and more prominent every day. Talked through a bunch of this already. As far as the impact goes, Alfie took this payment and ran. They took this payment, they didn't pay Ransom Hub, and they shut down. So they are probably on a beach somewhere. But this is a situation where for weeks, medical practitioners and medical facilities just were not getting paid simply because the systems were not operational. They started to get some systems online. It was a very few. They had to rebuild everything, basically everything. And so that's why it took them so long to get everything back online. But yeah, everything was delayed for quite a long time, weeks. A ton of personal information was leaked, and again, it all started with Infostealer. Snowflake. So Snowflake is an interesting one. It was not a Snowflake breach. So let's be clear about that. It unfortunately there's really no other way to refer to it, I think, because this was a targeted campaign by threat actors to go after Snowflake instances and Snowflake accounts. They over the years. So what happened with Snowflake is there were contractors, basically IT contractors, that were doing various work for various companies. The big three that we'll talk about today are AT&T, Santander Bank, and Ticketmaster. But there were IT contractors that worked for various companies doing, different work. And what occurred was there were info stealers on these contractors' machines. And so a whole bunch of credentials for various Snowflake instances were identified in stealer logs. And so what they did was they went through and they said, all right, we have whatever 200 login pairs for Snowflake, right? And they basically just enumerated through and they went and saw, all right, well, can we log in? Are these valid credentials? Nick talked about how, like, it'll cost more if there's validated data. And so basically they went through and they validated this data that they had. Again, no MFA on these Snowflake accounts. So they lack basic security controls. Snowflake has actually a really good documentation around various controls that you should put in place, including MFA, including things like network access controls, so you can do allow listing and that kind of thing on your Snowflake instance. The ones that were exploited did not have any of these basic security controls in place. And so, these threat actors had these lists of login pairs for Snowflake. They went through and they logged in pretty much and checked to see if it worked. The three that I talked about already, for AT&T, essentially all of AT&T's call and text records were stored in their Snowflake instance. So the threat actors gained access to basically everything AT&T has. Ticketmaster, about 560 million customers' data showed up on the dark web and for sale, like on one of those dark web forums that I showed you earlier. And about 30 million customers' data showed up for sale from Santander Bank. In total, there's about 165 organizations who had their data exfiltrated, who were essentially breached because of this. And again, it all started from Infostealer logs. So we can't say it enough. Infostealer logs are on the rise even more than they have been. MFA, absolutely a requirement. No question. If we look at a timeline, April 14th, 2024, what happened here was Mandiant researchers at Mandiant identified that Infostealer source credentials were being used to access Snowflake instances. So, there are different logging and reporting mechanisms you can put in place with Snowflake to see who's accessing them, what they're doing, what kind of queries they're running, that kind of thing. And so Mandiant had this telemetry and could correlate and see that, hey, these credentials are in Stealer logs. We're seeing suspicious activity in these Snowflake instances, and they put the two together and identified that. In May 20th to the 27th, detection. So this is the first confirmed detection from outside of Mandiant, where Live Nation identified that their Ticketmaster Snowflake instance had been accessed in an unauthorized way. In May and June, Mandiant and Snowflake started to actually alert victims, and again, about 165 companies were included in this. AT&T disclosed in July, and then in June and July, some victims began to receive extortion demands. So again, right out of the playbook is, hey, pay us X amount of money, or we will release this data. And so the threat actors, in this case, it was Shiny Hunters, which is notorious for data breaches and specifically extortion as it relates to data breaches. Shiny Hunters started to put that out on the dark web and or attempt to extort these organizations to not release their data. At the end of the day, a whole bunch of data was actually released. If we borrow this attack path diagram from Mandiant, we can see that it started with Infostealer malware, which was in this case on a work device for IT contractors that were accessing these Snowflake instances. The threat actors gained access to these. In this case, it was UNC 5537, which was a threat actor which went in and they automated this process. So they moved very quickly when they did this. They did a little bit of testing just to validate credentials and that kind of thing. But what they did was they automated the whole process via scripting, and they automated the whole process to just take the list of creds that they had, automatically log in, do a little bit of reconnaissance, and then just dump all the database tables. So they did it very, very quickly and basically exfiltrated all that data. And that's basically how it operated. It started again from Infostealers, started from the credentials, threat actors, automated the process, just went through and completely wiped out these two, these 165 Snowflake instances. So again, very, very lucrative and very cost effective method for threat actors to gain access and then lead to really big breaches. So
I put together a little lab demonstration for this webinar. It's on our GitHub at that address. Basically, there's a PDF and a series of PowerShell files. One builds on top of the next, so they're numbered, and they basically introduce a new feature or technique that you can learn about. So if you go through the PDF, it'll basically walk you through kind of what each step is doing, and you can review the code, and then there'll be some questions for each section that you can try and answer. And basically it's just to show some of the techniques that are used by these Infostealers, and PowerShell is pretty straightforward scripting language to start messing with. So we did it in there. It also doesn't need to be like compiled or anything like that. So hopefully, everyone thinks they can get something out of it and basically walk through it. It probably wouldn't take longer than a couple hours to go through and get the most out of it.
that's cool. So like the actual what kind of techniques is it doing? Are they walking through?
The first thing's going to basically walk through setting up a temporary directory to write files to, just like Infostealers would. And then it's going to talk about fingerprinting the host, so collect a bunch of information about the victim host in this case, stuff like hardware identifiers, so like amount of what OS version it is, installed RAM, what type of CPU, stuff like that. And then it's going to format that into like different JSON file. And then it's going to go over the legacy method of stealing browser credentials for like V10 and V11 before Chrome implemented the app-bound encryption, because the methods for dumping those and decrypting them were a little bit too involved to put into like a smaller script like this. So it's basically talking about the legacy method. It'll show how that used to work, and then show the username password key pairs. And then basically, I think the last thing is it goes over a method of just walking certain interesting directories and looking for interesting files that it might look for, and then grouping those all together and creating a zip file. The last two sort of like objectives or learning points in it is to upload this to some sort of C2 server, which is not implemented in the code. That you can work on that on your own, but you can opt for upload it to a webhook or upload it to a Dropbox or something like that. But I left that up to the user.
Very cool. Well, yeah, if you want to check that out, that's on our GitHub. You see the link there, and sounds like some pretty good stuff. The Infostealers are, I think, an important technique to understand, not only from a defensive but an offensive perspective, and understand, kind of the effect that they've had on the industry, and that this is a big part of where threat actors have been going and will continue to go. So. But that's all we got. If you have any questions, happy to answer them. You know where to find us, risk360.com/Armada. Armada is our team. Do the advanced technical work here at Risk360. Feel free to reach out to us anywhere. Twitter, X nowadays, showing my age. X, LinkedIn, anywhere else. And we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Talk to you guys soon.